Have you ever imagined losing everything in a single day? Your wealth, your family, your health, everything you love, everything you built, gone in an instant. What would you do? Would you curse God? Or would your faith remain unshakable? Today we dive into the story of a man who lived through the darkest nightmare anyone could face. A man who, even in the midst of unbearable pain, showed the world what true faith really means. Because the story of Job is not just one of loss, it's one of the most powerful and shocking stories of faith and perseverance you will ever hear. If this story hasn't reached you before in this way, stay with us. Let's explore together the incredible lessons of faith, endurance, and trust that the Bible reveals through his life. Job was a man admired by all. He lived in a prosperous land called Uz, a region blessed with abundance. His wealth was unmatched. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 pairs of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a great number of servants who managed his vast estates. But what truly set Job apart was not his riches, it was his character. Job was known for being upright, just, and above all, deeply faithful to God. He turned away from evil. He feared the Lord in a way few did in those days. His family, 7 sons and 3 daughters, would gather regularly for joyful banquets. And Job, always concerned for their spiritual well-being, would offer sacrifices on their behalf, just in case they had sinned without realizing it. To everyone who knew him, Job seemed untouchable. Surrounded by blessings, walking in the ways of God, he appeared to be the perfect example of divine justice at work. But was Job's life destined to continue down this path of endless blessing? Far beyond the peaceful life Job knew, in the invisible realms of heaven, a conversation was taking place. A conversation between angels and celestial beings, one that would change everything. Far beyond Job's sight, an unexpected conversation began. In the courts of heaven, God, in all his majesty, asked Satan a question. "Where have you come from?" And with cold indifference, Satan replied, "I have been roaming the earth, walking back and forth through it." Then God, like a father proud of his most faithful servant, pointed to Job. "Have you seen my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, blameless, upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." These were not mere words. They were a reflection of Job's reputation, both in heaven and on earth. But Satan wasn't impressed. With a sinister smile, he threw down a challenge. "Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge of protection around him and everything he owns? Take it all away, and see if he doesn't curse you to your face." It was a daring accusation. And yet God, confident in the purity of Job's faith, allowed Satan to test him. But there was one condition. "Everything he has is in your hands," God said, "but do not lay a finger on him." And with those words, the stage was set for a tragedy Job could never have foreseen. Back on earth, while Job lived unaware, surrounded by peace and prosperity, dark forces were already moving against him. A storm of suffering was about to descend. And the man who had known only the favor of God would soon face the greatest test of his life. It all began on a day like any other. As his servants worked the fields, as his children gathered for another joyful banquet, disaster was already on its way. Suddenly, a messenger arrived. Job stood breathless, his heart racing, his eyes wide with terror. A servant came running, panic written all over his face. "The Sabaeans attacked," he cried out. "They stole all your oxen and donkeys. They slaughtered your servants with the sword. I alone escaped to tell you." Before Job could even grasp the horror of the news, another servant arrived, his face pale, trembling. "Job," he gasped. "Fire fell from the sky, it consumed your sheep, and all the servants who tended them. I am the only one left alive." Job staggered backward, his world crumbling with every word. But the nightmare was far from over. A third messenger arrived, breathless, covered in dust, despair etched deep in his face. "The Chaldeans," he cried. "They formed 3 raiding parties, they took your camels, killed your servants. Only I survived to bring you this news." But nothing could prepare Job for the 4th messenger. This man approached slowly, his eyes full of tears, his voice barely a whisper, choked with grief. "Job, your sons and daughters, they were feasting in the oldest brother's house, when a powerful wind came from the desert. It struck the house with such force, the walls collapsed, and they all perished." Silence fell. Job's soul shattered. In a single moment, everything he loved, everything he had built, was gone. The weight of the tragedy crushed him. He fell to his knees, his body trembling, his heart torn to pieces. Surrounded by the ashes of his life, Job tore his robe in mourning. He reached for the dust of the earth, casting it upon his head, a symbol of his desolation. But what Job did next silenced heaven and earth. Instead of cursing God, instead of giving in to rage or despair, Job fell to the ground and worshipped. Through broken sobs, through unimaginable pain, he uttered words that would echo throughout eternity. With his knees pressed against the dust, with his face marked by tears, and his soul torn apart by grief, Job raised his trembling voice to heaven, not with rebellion, but with surrender. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The same God who had once filled his life with blessings, had now allowed everything to be taken away. But instead of accusing, instead of questioning, Job whispered words that echoed through eternity. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. These words were not born from comfort. They were forged in the furnace of suffering. Who, after losing everything, could still praise God? Was it faith? Was it resignation? Or was it the desperate clinging of a soul that, stripped of everything, still chose to hold on to the only thing it had left? God himself. His trust in the Creator remained unshaken, even in the midst of the greatest pain of his life. Job did not accuse God of injustice. But what he didn't know was that his trial was far from over. The enemy who had stalked him from the shadows since the beginning was still not satisfied. A new wave of suffering was about to fall upon Job. And this time, it would not be against his possessions. It would strike his very flesh. After losing everything, his wealth, his children, his peace, Job believed his pain could not grow any deeper. But the darkness was only beginning to unfold. Once again, Satan appeared before God. And with cold malice, he launched a new challenge, skin for skin. A man will give all he has to save his own life. Stretch out your hand, touch his flesh and bones, and he will curse you to your face. And God, trusting fully in the integrity of his servant, allowed it. Satan could afflict his body, but not take his life. And that was when the true nightmare began. Overnight, Job was struck by a plague of unbearable sores. Painful wounds spread across his body, from head to toe. His skin burned like fire. Every movement became torture. The man once known for strength and wisdom, now sat in ashes. A broken figure, holding a shard of pottery in his trembling hand, scraping the wounds that devoured his flesh. His body was destroyed, but his soul was even more shattered. And as if the pain wasn't enough, his own wife, seeing him disfigured and defeated, whispered words colder than death. Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. Her bitter voice echoed in the silence. A silence heavier than all the suffering Job had endured. But what hurt the most was not the loss of his possessions, nor the pain that consumed his body. What crushed Job's heart was the silence. A silence heavier than any wound. The God who had always been so near, now seemed distant, unreachable. Job, who every day sought the Creator in devotion, now faced the terrifying emptiness of the heavens. Where was the one who had always protected him? Where was the voice that once guided his steps? No, not a word, not a sign. The physical pain was unbearable, but the absence of God was perhaps even more devastating. The silence of the Almighty hovered over Job like a shadow that fed his doubts, that multiplied his anguish. He did not understand. He knew he was not perfect, but he also knew he had not committed sins that deserved such calamity. Yet even without answers, Job remained silent before God, waiting, longing for a response that never came. And while Job waited, something unexpected was drawing near. From distant lands, his friends came to see him. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. Men who, like Job, believed in divine justice. Men who had heard of his tragedy and came to comfort him. But nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. From afar, they barely recognized him. The man once admired by all, now sat in ashes, wounded, broken, silent. And when they saw him, their hearts sank. For 7 days and 7 nights, they sat beside Job, without speaking a single word. The weight of that pain was greater than any word they could offer. Silence was the only way to share in his suffering. But silence does not last forever. And when their words finally came, they were not of comfort. What should have been compassion slowly turned into subtle accusations. Eliphaz was the first to speak, and what followed would test Job's faith even further. Then one of his friends stood up. His eyes were serious, his voice heavy. He suggested that no one suffers so deeply without a reason. In his mind, it could only be the consequence of some hidden sin. "Remember," he said, "who has ever perished being innocent?" Those words fell on Job like salt on an open wound. He knew who he was. He knew he was an upright man. And hearing such insinuations from his own friends, that hurt even more. But what should have been comfort soon turned into confrontation. They were certain of one thing: no one suffers so much without having done something wrong. In their minds, God's justice was simple, almost mathematical. The righteous prosper, the wicked suffer. And if Job was drowning in tragedy, it had to mean he had strayed from the path. The silence that once filled the air was shattered, now replaced by a storm of subtle accusations. What began as a dialogue turned into a heated debate. But Job's heart could not accept their explanation. Deep within him, something was crying out. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had done nothing wrong to deserve such calamity. His lips, though trembling with pain, spoke with unshakable conviction. "I'm not unjust. My hands are clean," he said. But his friends kept insisting, each one more certain than the other. For them, God was just, and if Job was suffering, it was because he deserved it. The debate grew more intense with every word spoken. And there, surrounded by men marked by despair and the arrogance of their own certainties, Job began to ask deeper questions. "Why do the wicked prosper?" he asked. "Why do the evil live in peace, while the righteous face torment?" In that moment, Job began to touch the mystery of life. His suffering was beyond punishment. It was the beginning of an enigma, a divine silence, hiding answers that he was not yet ready to understand. It was a mystery that neither Job nor his friends could unravel. The more they spoke, the more isolated Job became, trapped not only in his pain but in their cruel judgments. They had not come to comfort him, they had come to accuse him. And in that desolation, Job lifted his voice, not to men but to the heavens. Where was God in all of this? His sorrow began to twist into rebellion, like dark clouds slowly forming across a silent sky. Every word spoken against him was like a dagger, breaking something deep within his soul. How could this be? How could a man who had walked in righteousness now find himself abandoned, crushed beneath the weight of misery? But the deepest wound of all was the silence, the unbearable silence of God. Job's heart burned with anguish. The one he had served so faithfully seemed distant, hidden. And so he cried out, his voice raw, his strength gone. "I cry out to you, O God, but you do not answer me." His words rose like a storm, shaking the heavens with desperate questions. Why do the wicked prosper? Why do the righteous fall into ruin while evil men flourish? His life, once strong like a mighty tree, now lay broken, fallen to the ground. Yet within his pain, something began to awaken. A desperate hunger, not just for relief, but for meaning. He longed for an audience with God, to stand before the Creator, to ask, "What?" His questions were not born of bitterness, but of raw honesty. Questions soaked in tears, shaped by suffering. And then, when all seemed lost, when the silence had become unbearable, a voice shattered the heavens. God spoke, but the answer was nothing Job could have expected. It wasn't a calm explanation or a gentle word of comfort. God spoke to Job out of a whirlwind, a powerful storm, as if creation itself were making itself known. "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" His voice echoed like thunder, grand, overwhelming, shaking the very ground beneath Job. But God didn't give him the answers he desperately longed for. Instead, he questioned him, leading Job into the heart of the mystery to confront the vastness of the universe. "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you understand." It wasn't about explaining suffering, it was about showing Job something infinitely greater. Human knowledge was small, fragile, when compared to the grandeur of creation. God challenged him to look at the sky, to consider the stars, the oceans, the wild creatures that roam the earth. Every detail revealed wisdom and power beyond anything Job could imagine. And then the answer became clear, without needing to be said directly. There are mysteries in this world that no man can grasp. Job felt small, almost insignificant, before the majesty of the universe. All his thoughts, all his questions, all his accusations, now seemed so small in the face of eternity. What God revealed was overwhelming. The Creator didn't owe explanations for every moment of suffering. He who governs the heavens and the earth knows infinitely more than the human mind can comprehend. Job realized that his cries, though sincere, were limited by human vision. How could he, a mere man, understand the depths of the divine plan? It was like trying to see the ocean floor while standing on the shore. And then the image of the potter and the clay became clear. Could the clay question the potter about what was being shaped? God was the potter, and Job, just a small part of creation. With the echo of God's voice still resounding in his heart, Job bowed his head in humility. I spoke of things I did not understand, he whispered. Things too wonderful for me to know. His words were no longer born of anger or rebellion, but of awe, an honest recognition of his own smallness before the greatness of the Creator. He no longer needed answers to every question. He now understood that some mysteries were far beyond what any man could carry. And it was after this moment of surrender, after this profound revelation, that something extraordinary began to unfold in Job's life. The scars of pain still marked his skin. The memories of loss still echoed in his heart. But something inside him had changed forever. Job no longer searched for explanations. He no longer wrestled with the need to understand the reason behind every suffering. He had seen the greatness of God. He had accepted his place in the vastness of creation. And then, in that moment of pure humility and silent reverence, the impossible began to happen. God, who had allowed Job to walk through the valley of trials, began to restore everything that had been lost. His fields, once devastated, now bloomed greener than ever before. His sheep and cattle multiplied beyond counting. Children were born again, filling Job's house with laughter and new life. It wasn't just restoration. It was abundance, overflowing like a river after a long drought. But even greater than the return of his wealth, something far deeper had been healed within Job. He was no longer the same man. Suffering had shaped him. Pain had purified his faith, making it unshakable, real, eternal. Now Job sat beneath the shade of a tree. His sons and daughters surrounded him. His wealth stretched out before him. But as he looked at it all, he knew the truth. The greatest treasure was no longer measured in possessions. For now, Job no longer knew God from stories or distant words. He had encountered the living God face to face. Job now understood something profound. He was not the master of life. He was not the author of his own story. He was clay, fragile, shaped by the hands of a sovereign and mysterious potter. He had learned that suffering carries mysteries far beyond human comprehension. And true faith is not built on having all the answers, but on trusting even when heaven remains silent. The world may collapse. Questions may never find an answer. But there is peace, a peace that rises when the soul surrenders to this truth. The Creator is in control, even when we cannot understand His ways. Thus, the story of Job is not just about loss or reward. It is about standing firm when the ground beneath your feet gives way. It is about seeing beyond tragedy and discovering that true wealth does not lie in what life can give, but in a faith that survives even when everything else is gone. Marked by invisible scars, Job knew this was his greatest treasure. For in the heart of the fiercest storm, God remains present. Even when His voice feels distant, His hands still sustain us. And it was in that trust that Job found his greatest victory. If this moving story of Job inspired you, and if you want to continue discovering other powerful stories of faith and overcoming, don't forget to like this video, share it with those you love, and subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore the most extraordinary lessons of the Bible.